Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I am delighted that you are joining us for our webinar on soccer diplomacy. What we'll be doing today is we'll talk about the recent book, Soccer Diplomacy, International Relations and Football Since 1914, which offers reflections on the role the sport has played in international relations. We're joined by the volume's editor, Heather Dichter, who is an associate professor of sport history and sport management at the Montfort University, as well as by two of the contributors, Roy McCree, a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, and Paul Dietschy, who is professor of contemporary history at the University of Franche-Comté. Finally, last but not least, we are joined by my colleague, Dalibor Rohac, who is here at AEI as a resident scholar. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the book in general, about a few of the specific chapters, and we'll touch upon some other issues related to the broad concept of soccer diplomacy. If you have any questions, please submit them. You can do that either via Twitter or via email. Details are on the event page. With that, welcome to our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start with a few questions for Heather. Heather, as you are the editor of the volume, can you maybe explain to us what is the idea behind this edited volume? What are the topics you try to cover? What is the sort of the mission of the project?
Well, thanks so much for having us here to talk about soccer diplomacy. This book came together, and has a lot of different scholars who work on soccer and diplomacy. And so I think, the book really just brings together so much different work that really spans the entire globe to show just how important and widespread, the world's most popular sport, and obviously such an important issue within politics as diplomacy, just shows how widespread it is. And so the book, every scholar wrote their chapter, and then when they came together, as the editors, it was seeing what themes come out of all of this. And, naturally all of the, and wonderfully surprising, all of the chapters read together so well. And that different themes and ideas keep reappearing throughout the past century, or even more than a century, of soccer and diplomacy. I think while none of the chapters focus on it, money is kind of an underlying item, especially once you get to the issues of the big events such as the World Cup or the continental tournaments. But there's just so much that soccer just really has been so important and such a presence within diplomacy, and also the different soccer federations, organizations, trying to use diplomacy themselves to achieve various goals throughout the past century or so.
What are some of the ways in which soccer has played that role within diplomacy? So I think the two things people will probably think of most immediately are just basic marketing for a country or a regime, and maybe attempts to construct soft power, right? But you could think of other things too, right? So you could cover for negotiations, or I don't know. Could you talk about that a little bit? Just a range of different ways in which soccer and diplomacy are intertwined that you highlight in the book.
Absolutely, and the first thing you pointed out, it's with these mega events that really come through, through the World Cup, through the continental tournaments, various other competitions, that the host country, and in these cases, it's often a country, not a city, like with the Olympic Games. It is really that sense of soft power, and how does this country want to portray itself to the world? And in some cases, it is countries that are on a rising trajectory, and kind of use these events to kind of, show, look, we've arrived on this world stage. Other times it might be about changing a perception, or trying to put forward a different view of that country, or a very specific view of that country to the world. Along with that, there can also be, particularly in more recent times, some more marketing, sponsorship, kind of business side of things where diplomacy may come into play with that. So that's really one of the biggest areas that we see soccer diplomacy really coming into play and happening throughout much of the past century.
And so if you were to, one question people may have is, so how effective is this instrument of diplomacy? Is there a way to assess that you find particularly convincing? What's your broad takeaway on that front? Like, is this worth focusing on for foreign ministries, for national governments? What do you think the takeaway is there?
That evaluating it, and is this successful or not? That's always a really difficult question. And with each country having, or organization having their own goals, a national soccer governing body might have a different goal for hosting than the country, and the government having a different goal. So, one might be more, feel that they've been more effective in achieving success in their aims than perhaps the other. It is pretty difficult, and it's one, for assessing it, and it's one where you really aren't going to be able to make that decision, a week after the tournament ended to say, like, yes, it was a success in that respect. I think sport organizations do often say, at the end of the event, this was our most successful event. This was a great event. We had X number of spectators. We made this much money, that we had this many global viewers. But, from a diplomatic side of things, it does take more time to make those determinations. And I think that's something that as historians, as time passes and seeing what else happens or what those initial goals were, sometimes those assessments can be made, and sometimes they're a mixed decision as to parts were achieved, parts weren't. It's tough.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I think Dalibor will want to start jumping in here too. Let's talk a little bit too about the chapter that you yourself have contributed to the book, which is about East Germany, really, and its participation in international soccer games and the role of NATO in letting that happen or not letting that happen. Can you talk a little bit about the chapter? And I think then Dalibor has some questions about how this relates to great power competition more generally. But can you bring us up to speed on the situation in East Germany?
On this country that no longer exists. Absolutely. Yeah. So in the early 1960s, East Germany was recognized by FIFA, but within the Olympic movement, the IOC forced East and West Germany to compete with an all German, a combined German Olympic team between both East and West Germany in the 50s and 60s for most of both of those decades. So for Olympic qualification, East and West Germany would play against each other, and then whichever team won, that would be the team that would represent Germany, or this combined German team. And so in preparation for the 64 Olympics, the East Germans beat the West German team. And so East Germany was Germany. And so the East German team, but as Germany, was able to ultimately travel to NATO countries to try to qualify for the Olympics. But when it came to UEFA competitions, where UEFA had, like FIFA, recognized East Germany separate from West Germany, so both UEFA competitions and other FIFA competitions, the East German team was not allowed to travel to NATO countries for really any sport. If it was a team that represented East Germany, this went against NATO regulations, particularly after there kind of came and went, but especially after the Berlin Wall went up, and those restrictions really were made tighter. And so it became kind of confusing in some respect to the general public, like, why is East Germany allowed to come play soccer now, but then they're not for another time, and into different countries or not? And it had this confusing level of so
just for background, this did not apply to other Warsaw Pact countries, right? So this is an East Germany specific issue, and so would the NATO member states just forfeit their games? Is that how it worked, or what was the?
So yes, this was a regulation specific to East Germany, that when West Germany joined NATO, all of the NATO member states agreed to support West Germany's policy of not recognizing East Germany. So all the other Warsaw Pact states could enter, they needed to also apply and receive visas. There might have been various reasons at times where, for whatever reason, some of those states and teams might not have received them. But in general, the Warsaw Pact states, other than East Germany, were able to enter and play. What happened was always a complicated, it kind of depended on the sport being played. Was it a team sport or individual sport? And how strong was the Soviet Union in that event as to what all the other Eastern Bloc states would do. In many cases, when East Germany wasn't allowed a visa, a lot of the Soviet Bloc teams, they would en masse withdraw and boycott, and they would often wait till very close to the competition began to try to have mass, as the biggest disruption to the capitalist West as they could, even though they had decided several weeks earlier they were going to withdraw. But there were instances, particularly when the Soviet team was, and its athletes were really, really good at certain sports, and they didn't want to lose out on that occasionally they still played, but obviously, or participated. But individual sports, there's always less disruption because it's an individual sport. But team sports like soccer would have that greatest level of disruption because you have your groups, and now all of a sudden you have uneven groups. So sometimes at the last minute, they would have to reorganize the groups. Sometimes, one group would just have two teams and they'd play each other and that was it. So it did become complicated for the organizers.
I see. So Dalibor, what do you think? Should we have Taiwan and the People's Republic face off before every sports event to see who gets to participate?
Well, Stan, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm not quite sure how I deserve to be here. I can claim expertise neither in soccer nor in diplomacy per se, but I really enjoyed this volume. I commend it highly to our viewers, and I was particularly intrigued, I have to say, by Paul's chapter on interwar France in terms of this sort of great power competition when you have this highly polarized country, right, which is facing sort of a new geopolitical environment after the First World War, and is using soccer as a tool of geopolitical engagement, first as a tool of rapprochement with Germany in the 20s, and then as a sort of place of intensifying power competition, particularly with the fascist regime in Italy and the Nazi regime in Germany. You had the World Cup held in 1938 in France. And interestingly enough, as this competition intensifies in the 30s, the French government sort of drops the ball on soccer as an instrument of engagement, partly because of other sports, partly because of just lots of other things happening at the same time. So I was intrigued to sort of think through the parallels and differences that might exist between that world of the interwar period, or indeed between the sort of Cold War era and the present day. In Washington right now, obviously every conversation turns towards China and sort of competition with China. You have the Beijing Winter Olympics looming next year. There is a debate about how that should be approached, whether it should be boycotted or sort of what sort of policy should be put in place. So clearly, international sports is going to be one of the front lines. Maybe not necessarily soccer though, and I think that's one of the differences between the past and the present. That soccer is not necessarily central to American popular culture, nor is it terribly central to.
And China's pretty bad.
Chinese
yeah.
one. So actually, China has invested quite heavily into soccer. They have recruited international players. There is a professional league. There's a super league. They have actually pretty bad reputations for sort of match fixing and corruption. And I think the national teams. So the women's team, I think, is ranked number 14 worldwide. The men's team is pretty bad, 77th. And in the past, there were some sort of pretty embarrassing incidents where they would lose to Syria in 2018 in a World Cup qualifier, resulting in sort of uproar at home. The 2013 match against Thailand resulted in riots when the Chinese team lost 1-5. So that's clearly one of the differences where sort of probably soccer is not going to be the front line necessarily, but probably other sports are. And sort of interesting to think through. I would love to sort of know more about the sort of political realities of the Third Republic as a sort of polarized and then divided society, because obviously the United States is in a pretty polarized place at this present moment, and we've seen the efforts at public diplomacy over the past year being pretty haphazard, with public broadcasting going through massive swings in staffing and sort of all aspects of public outreach being sort of pretty divisive, and so that might not be perhaps the best place to start, the best starting point for sort of showcasing liberal democratic sportsmanship in opposition to the rising autocratic powers of the world. So I would just love to hear from the authors the sort of their thinking about the parallels, particularly between the Cold War era and the Interwar period, and the place where we are right now, and what sort of lessons could be drawn from how big sporting events could be tackled by democratic governments going forward.
Paul, do you want to go first, and also tell us a little bit about what's in your chapter?
Yes, I don't think if I have to answer now to the query about the comparison between the interwar and the Cold War. Maybe I can begin with that. I think the difference between the two periods is that sport was used because, as say Raymond Aron in France about the Cold War, war is unexpected. So sport was a way to display the power of the US and the USSR. In the interwar, it's a bit different, because at the beginning of the period, France has a main powerful army in Europe, and France intervened, for instance, in 1923 in the Ruhr because of the reparations. So sport was finally a way of display a kind of image, but I think at least during the 20s it was more important than in the 50s or the 60s. We can say that in the 30s it was different, because there were this political policy, sport policy from the totalitarian states like Italy and Germany. So if we see we know the end, that is to say the Second World War, but you can consider that this growing power in sport is in a way a beginning of the war, which will occur in 1939. During the Cold War, war was impossible, because it was between US and USSR. It was a nuclear war, so the end of the history and the end of the war. But if I can continue, maybe you have a question about my chapter in particular. But in fact, I think this chapter maybe is interesting because we are very used to consider that the sport diplomacy has been invented in the 30s by Italy or Germany, or even by, if you have read the good book by Peter Beck, even by Great Britain. In fact, it's France.
I was gonna ask you this, because the way your chapter reads, it very much is France comes up with it and then it backfires completely.
Yes, maybe it's new for you because you don't read the French literature and history. Because it's something which is new. I've already written about it in an article for the European Review of Cambridge. But yes, why we can wonder why it's France who begin. Why? Because first of all, the main great sport events like Olympic Games or the sport organization like FIFA were created by French, because it's a way of universalism. And then why France, after the First World War, it was a way for the French to oppose to the German propaganda. The sport was, I think Heather knows that, at the beginning of the 20s, sport was used as a way of military service and a way of displaying a remaining of power for Germany. So it was a way to oppose to this policy. And there was another fact. It was also a way of displaying an image of a country which was still strong after the 4 years of a terrible war, a quarter of the country which was completely destroyed, 1,003,100,000 young people who died. So it was a way of the Anglo-Saxon countries and powers say that France was not able to be the hegemonic power in Europe. So sport was a way of showing that France was still strong and could have influence. But demonstrate this through soccer was not very easy, because the French team were not at a very average level. For instance, there was a game between the French national team and Hungary, and you know maybe that the French government had a very strong sorry, I don't find the word, a very strong responsibility in the reshaping of Hungarian territory. So in 1927, there was a match in Budapest, and the French team lost 13-1 against the Hungarians. So for the French ambassador, it was not a very easy position in the stadium, seeing his team completely beaten by the Hungarians. So it was a problem for the French, that it was a way of constructing links through all around Europe, but the image of power was not very spread by the result of the national team.
Yeah, this theme comes back a few times, I think, throughout the book, that the question of, for soccer diplomacy to be effective, do you have to be successful at soccer, which is not, and it's not totally obvious, right? I think for certain purposes, it doesn't really matter, right? If you are trying to establish relations or whatever, it's more symbolic perhaps. But so Paul, the soccer diplomacy in the interwar period obviously comes to an end because of World War II. And so I think people are somewhat familiar probably with German and Italian efforts at deploying sports for public diplomacy purposes, but can you maybe talk to us a bit about the 1938 World Cup and how it really all comes to an end in a way?
Yeah. It was, first of all, it was a World Cup who came just after the Italian World Cup, in which the fascist government could have shown a very beautiful stadium, a very good organization, and at the end, a victory. Even so, the referees helped a lot the Italian team. For the French competition, it was very different, because the French Front Populaire government refused to build a very big stadium in Paris. And there were some modern stadiums like in Bordeaux and Marseille, but the other could not be compared with the Italian ones. The atmosphere, it was a very mixed atmosphere, because the French were very happy because of the elimination of the German team by Switzerland, for instance. So there was some ideological and political atmosphere in the stands. For instance, like when Italian play against Norway and Brazil in Marseille, the public was really against the Italians. They were shouting against them, and it was very hard for these players. And in the other hand, the Italian players made the fascist salute just at the beginning of the games. They played in a black shirt, black jersey exactly, against the French, there was the idea of display their ideological representation, and at the end they won. So when you read the French press at the end of the competition, there is a mixed feeling. There is quite a great admiration towards the Italian, who played beautifully, and they want to follow this path. But there is also the idea of young nation, the Italian, who won in a very old nation, the French, during the 30s. There is also a demographic depression in France. Some year the number of deaths outpassed the number of births. So at the end, it was a very, very mixed feeling. The French public considers that, the French opinion considers that finally the organization was good and the competition was interesting. But there was this bitter feeling of this Italy at a moment in which the relationship between France and Italy was deteriorating.
I see. Yeah, that was the sense I got. And so there really is, right? It's not right. Just like any other foreign policy move, I guess there's a risk to it to backfiring. Heather, before we go to Roy, can I ask you basically the same question? Do you think there are any? Because obviously NATO is really central, and the conflict with the Soviet Union is really central to your chapter. Do you think there are any takeaways for today? Do you think what NATO was trying to do paid off in any sense? What's your thinking there?
It was not just the soccer, but kind of how NATO approached East Germany and sport as a whole was quite challenging for them, because the policy against East Germans and those travel restrictions, it wasn't just on athletes, it was to scientists and academics and all sorts of people. But the problem was, if the metallurgists or whatever scientists weren't given visas to go travel to a conference on their science field, that didn't really make the news. Whereas the big athletes and the teams, when they couldn't go, that made the news, not just in East Germany and behind the Iron Curtain, but very much in the countries who were hosting these events. And so in many ways, the policy kind of backfired from a PR sense to within the NATO countries, because NATO has long struggled with its image and perception, and the sense of the countries have to pay a lot of money towards NATO and to supporting it, but what do they get in return for it? And then what they see is NATO's in the population see NATO's not allowing the soccer team to come. Now our event's ruined, or we can't have the best athletes. Why is this? And so it became this PR battle within NATO, and that the NATO and its governments and foreign ministries and that were constantly trying to put forward a different line on, getting the NATO line out. And then actually these restrictions are in response to East German political actions. And, it was their preventing of, blocking that travel between East and West Germany themselves, not letting, with the creation of the wall. And so trying to make sure that the kind of doing a PR campaign on this within basically all the countries as they each hosted different sporting events. So it was quite challenging. And then ultimately with détente and then the IOC recognizing East Germany in the end, they just kind of do away with these travel restrictions. And then obviously East Germany competes in every sport quite strong, and some of them quite strongly for the last couple decades of its existence as a country.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I see. Interesting. The one thing I noticed, and we chatted about this a little bit before the webinar, is that the Dutch government was really trying to get NATO to be more flexible on this front, and yet couldn't really make it happen, despite the fact that the Secretary General of NATO was Dutch at the time. And so, really shows you what those international positions get you, in terms of actual power. With that, let's move a little bit closer to the present. Roy has a great chapter in the book that is more about diplomacy within the sport than across countries, I would say. And the central figure of the chapter is Jack Warner, who some of our audience may have heard of. Roy, do you want to talk about the chapter a bit, talk about the figure of Jack Warner, and talk about some of the themes that you discuss?
Okay, sure. Greetings to my fellow panelists and all viewers and listeners. I want to start by thanking Stan and his team for organizing this event. Thanking the editor as well for giving me the opportunity to be involved in this book, as well as the publisher and other contributors. Before I became involved in this book, I was aware of the use of sport by nation states to pursue their particular political interests. I cite a few examples, not all of them involve the use of diplomacy. But firstly, there's a famous overused case, Heather might say, of the ping pong diplomacy between the US and China in the 1970s. Another instance, not so much of diplomacy, had to do with the use of sport to help delegitimize and dismantle the apartheid system. Although, as Stan points out, and that issue of the impact of the apartheid boycott or the use of sport to protest the apartheid system, the extent to which it contributed to the dismantling of apartheid, the jury is still out. The third example I used has to do with the US boycott of the Olympic Games in 1980, following the Russian in Soviet Union at the time, invasion of Afghanistan. And then in 1984, the Soviet Union's boycott of the Olympic Games in LA in response to the US government's invasion of Grenada. So before starting this book, I was well aware of how nation states use sport to shape or reshape their relations. This book, however, exposed me to a whole new concept called sport as diplomacy, or soccer as diplomacy in itself, which is speaking to how non-state actors like FIFA, like the IOC, engage in communication, engage in negotiation with states and with non-state actors like the media, sponsors, in staging particular competitions. That was an eye-opener for me. And I think that concept of sport as diplomacy, soccer as diplomacy, really enable us to see how small island states like Trinidad and Tobago and persons like Jack Warner could have an opportunity to influence the fortunes of bigger nation states in the world system of soccer, and how they can leverage it to pursue their own material and political interests in soccer. Through soccer as diplomacy, we see how the entire world system in general and world soccer system in particular can be turned on its head as small island states have the opportunity to influence the running of things, to influence decision-making, to influence who gets to hold whatever political tournament or one of FIFA's prize tournaments, whether it is the big, men's World Cup competition or the smaller under 17, World Cups and the like. And this particular concept has impacted me so much that I am now looking to do a follow-up paper examining the staging of the 2007 Cricket World Cup in the West Indies, which in that case involved the International Cricket Council engaging in negotiation and communication with the over 12 small island states in the Caribbean to stage this particular cricket tournament, and also involve engaging with companies like B-Sky-B and the host of the plethora of media companies that cover cricket. So that is the next project on my agenda, and it is coming out of this discovery of mine through being involved in this book that sport constitutes its own form of diplomacy sui generis, as they say, in itself. And I think that has been a definite contribution. Thanks to Murray and Pigman for coming up with this concept. And I think it is very useful as an explanatory concept to explain certain dynamics within FIFA, as well as a non-state actor, as well as to explain certain dynamics between non-state actors and state actors in the staging of international sport competition.
If I can just jump in here too, as the editor, I was so pleased with all of the chapters in the book, but just kind of following up on one of the things that Roy said, what was so kind of fascinating about the geographical spread of just the chapters within the book is that it's not just, kind of soccer powers or the great powers politically and diplomatically where soccer comes into play with diplomacy, but it is, soccer powers and soccer not very good states. You can, especially the U.S. men's team in the 1950s playing against Iceland, that was important for U.S. Icelandic relations and the U.S. military as a whole, but then also as well for states that are not the great powers diplomatically, and particularly when it comes to those regional relationships. I think this book really only starts to scratch the surface of that. And I think what I'm so excited for, and I hope as a scholar that this book sets off even more research, particularly regionally, and I think looking beyond FIFA's World Cup and looking more so at the continental and even smaller regional competitions, there's so much more that could come out that I think we'll really see a lot of this soccer diplomacy playing out at the regional level, and neighboring states or states that may have slight tensions, that, I think this is where soccer diplomacy really has an opportunity to provide more insight to everyone, really.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, Roy, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just follow up on Heather's comment there to say that FIFA's very structure of decision-making, quote unquote, democratic structure of decision-making, where each country has a vote. You could be a country of 1 million. You have the same one vote as England with 70 million or the US with 300 million. Okay, one country, one vote. So this gives a region like CONCACAF, which has over around 30 votes, okay, and of which Jack Warner was president, and in which you can vote as a bloc. Okay, FIFA voting admits voting as a bloc. The African Union could vote as a bloc. So CONCACAF could vote as a bloc. So this, Jack Warner was aware of this. He leveraged this to position himself in the inner sanctum of FIFA and to become a body, quote unquote, body of Sepp Blatter when things were good. Let's bear in mind this, the under-17 FIFA Boys World Cup was staged in Trinidad and Tobago in 2001. The FIFA elections for president was in 2002. Jack Warner voted and all of CONCACAF for Sepp Blatter's re-election in 2002. Sepp Blatter publicly thanked him, for his support in winning the re-election bid. So that the structure of power or decision-making within FIFA allows small island states, give them a certain influence within the operations of the organization. But then Jack Warner was so positioned that he's now influencing the English bid. He's influencing the German bid, okay? He's influencing the Trinidad and Tobago government. Okay, so it positions him in a network of relationships within FIFA and outside of FIFA to exercise this influence that he was able to exercise. And in terms of impact, Stan, I know that is a thorny issue that you have raised, and I think Beck raises it as well in his conclusion. There are different levels of impact: political impact, economic impact, there's psychological impact. even though you have not won, Trinidad and Tobago were out in the first round of that under-17 World Cup. But the aim wasn't to qualify for the final. I mean, if we did, fine, you know, but there were other type of benefits. If you look at Jack Warner's bank account, you would see a tremendous impact that is measurable, that is quantifiable, okay? This impact didn't trickle down to the clubs. It didn't trickle down to the clubs in this country. It did not have that developmental impact. If you look at impact in terms of infrastructure, Jack Warner, through his company, constructed 4 new stadia in Trinidad and Tobago, 4. Seating capacity, 10,000, 15,000. They cost 70,000 million United States dollars. Jack Warner's company built those stadia. And then he got all the contracts to provide food and services during the tournament. His family's travel agency brought all the teams down to Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, so in terms of economic impact, he has benefited. In terms of infrastructural impact, the country benefited from 4 new sports stadia and stuff like that. In terms of the political impact, that probably is up in the air, but for Jack Warner, as an individual and as a black man, he's able to exercise his influence, you know, on the British and get Beckham to play in Trinidad, to get the English team to come to Trinidad. That is nothing less of a soccer coup. That's a coup d'etat. And he can only do it because of his position in FIFA and because of his proximity to the then reigning king, Sepp Blatter. Okay, so I think in terms of impact, one has to assess it at different levels. And based on how you approach it, yes, it's a kind of balance sheet stand you have to arrive at. What were the benefits? You know, what were the costs and the different levels of benefits? So I'm hearing a discussion about France and they lost, you know, badly. But it's something, the psychological impact for the French to say that we are not dead yet. We are still alive. So there is a symbolic political impact, a symbolic effect, you know, on staging these tournaments, on taking part in these tournaments. And even though you may lose badly, even though you may be out in the first round, countries feel a sense of what I call the P's: pride, prestige, passion, patriotism, and power. There's that sense that you get from staging these tournaments. It could last a few, as long as the tournament, but you know, that is one of the impacts that these tournaments have. And for a while, it had that impact in Trinidad and Tobago.
Nice. So I think Dalibor, I think, is interested in something you just mentioned, right? In FIFA as an international organization, and you know, I don't know. You wrote me an email about this, Dalibor. Do you want to say what you had in mind about this? Sure.
Actually, one of the things that Roy mentioned through, I guess, his sort of perspective as a sociologist struck a chord with me, which is the sort of question of how social scientists should think about the organization of these big international sporting events, which are neither, you know, organized by a single government. It's not a sort of top-down government sort of enterprise. Neither is it a pure market transaction. It's a sort of hybrid thing that involves lots of different actors, sports associations, governments, sponsors, fans, all sort of intricately sort of, you know, interacting with each other in this ecosystem. And I just want to say that I always had a soft spot for the work of Elinor and Vincent Ostroms. She was a political scientist, the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on polycentric governance, on sort of these emerging orders that come as a result of, I guess, interplay of many different sort of centers of decision making, each pursuing their respective interest within some framework of rules. And there has been actually some applied literature in the world of sports. Particularly, I saw a couple of papers on the Olympics, or organization of the Olympics, as various sort of policy aspects of it, such as security side of the Olympics, so how these different actors interact. So I'd love to actually read more on that. But to Stan's question, so one thing that strikes me as interesting is that these big one-off international sporting events, the World Cup or soccer tournaments at the Olympics, I suppose, are only a small part of the global appeal of soccer. I think more people around the world have very strong feelings about Arsenal or Manchester United than they have about the English national team. And so if you are interested in the role of soccer as a tool of diplomacy, want to leverage it in some way, then I suppose you have to pay attention to these sort of subnational and transnational, in some cases, enterprises such as the Premier League or the Champions League. And I think we are all reminded of it when this idea to create the European Super League was mentioned a couple of weeks ago, particularly after this extraordinary strong reaction by the UK government, as if this really were a matter of national emergency that deserved immediate policy response. Then our friend Oli Wiseman had what I thought was a great column in The Critic magazine, which is a British sort of magazine of ideas on this. And one thing he touches on, which I find quite interesting, is that these American Super League-like leagues in different sports, whether it's the NFL, NBA, or MLB, are strikingly parochial compared to the Premier League or the Champions League. I mean, you would find people around the world who know who James LeBron is, but I think the sort of appeal of American professional sports outside of America's borders is far more limited than the appeal of, say, European soccer. And so you have to wonder why that is, whether that's purely an attribute of soccer as a game, or whether that's also an attribute of the sort of organization of these leagues and of these sports. One thing you might want to look at is just the sort of what some would call a hyper commercialized nature of these American super leagues, where you can have owners who would take New Orleans Jazz and turn it mind-bogglingly into Utah Jazz, or they would take Brooklyn Dodgers, this beloved local team, the first one to break the color barrier in baseball, and just move it, across the continent and turn it into Los Angeles Dodgers. So whether that was something that maybe Boris Johnson was fearful of, that if you had the sort of status quo replaced by the super leagues, maybe more people around the world would just start tuning it out. On the other hand, you have to wonder, is Premier League and Champions League any better on that sort of commercial front, right? Like, you have all these teams in the hands of Russian oligarchs and Qatari princelings. Whether that's preferable. But anyway, sort of teasing out sort of policy lessons for how these sort of subnational and transnational questions should be handled if one is interested in the sort of appeal of soccer as a sort of tool of diplomacy would be really interesting.
So if I can jump in on this one for a second. So I think really the idea behind the European Super League, I really think you should think about it in terms of industrial organization and the sort of corporate strategy of the teams. So the American leagues are all quite closed with salary caps and really set up to maximize profits in a way that the European soccer leagues are not, right? So they're obviously there's tremendous amounts of revenue, but the teams aren't particularly profitable, and that's, I think, precisely what what eliminating promotion relegation dynamics was meant to address, right? Because the next step would be, you introduce salary caps within the European Super League, or you start moving franchises around maybe at least part of the year. And so I think that's really the background there, and that is in tension with, you know, what Roy mentioned, the you know, one country, one vote spirit of equal competition, or in this case, more precisely, the promotion relegation system that gives every team at least a theoretical chance to compete, right? And so you really have this tension between cartelization and profit maximization on the one hand versus maintaining the more, I guess, a spirit that comes from sportsmanship, right, where everyone has a chance to compete. Because I really don't think it is, for example, it's not really about competitiveness, right? No one complains about the German league, even though Bayern wins every year. You know, no one complains about the Italian league, even though Juventus wins every year. And, you know, obviously Spain is a pure duopoly, you know, through a first approximation as well. And so I don't think that's really the issue people were concerned about. It really is, you know, more about this spirit of everyone having at least a chance and making it through. But I don't know. So I think that's how I think of that. And I think it's clever for politicians to then jump to the rescue of that, you know, equal opportunity principle. And I think that's what Boris Johnson did pretty smartly. I think in retrospect, say Pedro Sanchez probably regrets not going in more aggressively, but I think he was worried that it would go through and he would look bad. I don't know if the other panelists have strong views on the European Super League, but Roy, do you want to go? Sorry.
Yeah. Just two things to complement or follow up on Dalibor's, is it Dalibor? The point about shifting the level of analysis from the state to the club or the league. And it reminds me of Beck's point in that conclusion that has me, dumbfounded. He talks about the English Premier League representing a particular form of soft power because, you know, it is admired, and in some parts of the world, particularly in my part of the world, you know, people get up at 4 in the morning, you know, 7 in the morning to watch Chelsea and Man U, and, you know, my team, by the way, is that. And that particular point, I think, is relevant in the Caribbean. With the emergence of the Premiership 1992, a lot of leagues renamed themselves the Premier League. The notion of Premier League became a household term or language to represent a particular quality of football, okay, internationally. So that point about shifting the level of analysis, I think it has merit. I'm not the expert in diplomacy as Heather, but I know in diplomacy, the unit of analysis is the state, okay? And with sport as diplomacy, the unit of analysis has shifted to the non-state actor. So the point is to bring the club and the league into that equation by including them as non-state actors as it relates to the dynamic of international sport and its function as a form of soft power, you know, between nations and countries. The second point about the Super League, I go to cricket just briefly. We have the Indian Premier League, which is what they call a franchise league. So it's just 10 teams, the same teams every year. There's no promotion and relegation. So my suggestion to the European guys is to establish a franchise system, okay, that does not have promotion and relegation. I don't know if that surely won't deal with the issues of fans' identity to teams and the whole democratic ethos, you know, that has come to define, you know, fandom and fan loyalty, which has always been problematic. A lot of fans have little or no say in the running of these big teams. Am I wrong, Stan? There's little fan. I mean, there's the stakeholders versus the shareholders, and the shareholders still loom large. You know,
a little different. Ironically, it's a little different in Germany, which has the most inequality within its league, probably, of the entire continent, where fans are in control. Yeah, Paul, I wanted to give you the chance to talk to.
That's my take.
if I can give a French point of view on the Super League, for me, it's what is at stake is the Americanization of the world and the circulation of sport model. For instance, the first professional league in England, the National League Football League at the end of the 19th century, was created on an American model, on a baseball league model. So it's the same now. That is to say that the club, the specificity of a club in Europe is to be linked to a community, to a special territory, not to be considered as a brand, a commercial brand, but the money serves only to win. What is at stake in the Super League is to transform this model of club linked to a community territory somewhere in the world, in a very specific place, in global brand, which could play everywhere. For instance, that's the case of Juventus. I know very well. I live in Turin some years ago, and Juventus now is an Italian team, maybe, but it's rather a brand than a club. And that's why they wanted to create this Super League. It's a competition between sports brands, but no more sports clubs.
Thank you, Paul. So we only have a few more minutes left. I want to ask one audience question and then one quick round of predictions. The audience question is from Nicolas Sanchez, who asks, what role did soccer really play in the soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador? Who can answer this question?
Maybe I can. In fact, it was more. There was this game for the qualification for the World Cup of 1970, but it was more a pretext for a relationship which was based on tension linked to the immigration from San Salvador to Honduras, the lack of fields and so on. So social and economical problem. So this game was a pretext to begin a war who could have occurred after or before anyway.
Do Heather and Roy, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so then my final question is, and I'm asking this because I referenced it in the event description. Who is going to win Euro 2020, which will obviously not take place in 2020, but will take place a month from now? What do you think? Who wants to go first?
Well, I will say that as a historian, I like looking at the past, not predicting the future. So I won't necessarily predict a winner, but from having been in Germany in 2006 and been a volunteer at the World Cup that year, I will cheer for Germany.
Well,
very good. Yeah. Paul, go ahead.
French are very chauvinist. So obviously we are world champion. No, seriously, I think the Italian have a great chance this year. I would say France or Italy.
Interesting. Italy has not done that well historically at the European Championship. I think they've only won once, right? They're more.
They won, yes, in 1968. So a long time ago.
Roy, what do you think?
Starting without the English Premiership, there will be no Dwight York, and there will be no Shaka Hislop. So I would go for England.
Interesting. England has never won the European Championship, so
there's always the first time.
Yeah, that's right. Dalibor, what do you think?
Actually, I haven't checked the betting markets on this one, but France strikes me as a very reasonable prediction, so I'm going to stick with France.
I think that's not a crazy one too. I obviously will have to go with my homeland of the Netherlands, even though it was announced today that Virgil van Dijk will not be playing, our captain, the Liverpool star player. So we'll see how that goes, but I have high hopes, as always, that will ultimately lead to deep disappointment. And on that note, we're out of time here. I want to thank all of our panelists for participating. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.